Oh, welcome everyone to the STOA. This is the first session of Thumos Awareness Week, a full week of sessions at the STOA discussing this concept called Thumos, which is often understood as spiritedness. And the likes of Homer, Plato, Aristotle have written about it. But surprisingly, there's not that much interest in this thing called Thumos, both in academic and para-academic circles. So hopefully we're going to change that here at the STOA. And the series is partly an excuse for Daniel Kazanjian and I to get a theoretical download on what Thumos is to help further inform the design of the praxis of the course we're launching in September, the third iteration of Beyond Self-Discipline, the Thumos Bootcamp edition. And I'll put a link to that in the chat in a moment. And we have three academic scholars coming on later in the week, but today we have everyone's favorite integral wild man, Layman Pascal, who's the host of Integral Stage. Every time he comes to STOA, he does these fire presentations, talks, so I'm really excited about this one. And he wrote the secret white paper on Thumos, and he sent it to me, and it was really good. And so the contents of that paper is going to be about the talk today. And today's session is Beyond Equilibrium, the Excessive Spirit of Thumos. So that being said, Layman, welcome back to the STOA, my friend. Oh, and this is how today's going to work. Layman's going to talk and then Q&A, so pop your questions in the chat anytime.
Yeah. Great topic. Always fun to be here with you, Peter. Hi, everybody. I guess I'm going to explore some interesting aspects of what we might call Thumos, and I'll ramble into that for a little while, and then we'll have an opportunity to dialogue and follow up with whatever anyone's interested in. But before I get started, Tom and Mark from Parallax Media's online academy in Europe will kill me if I don't mention the upcoming course, Non-Duality in the Network Age, which I privately call Deus Ex Mycelia. It'll be Sundays in September and fireside chats and some pre-recorded course material. I think there's still some spots available at parallaxmedia.eu/courses for exploring personal spirit and collaborative religious practice and community for meta-modern informational network-oriented web-like McLuhan-esque syntheological techno-integrative connectivity relationship and link-based culture, something I'm passionate about. And I'm sure you could find it if you searched up the words parallax courses and non-duality. So sign up for that and let's talk Thumos. The discourse around Thumos, I think, comes from two main places. Firstly, Socrates, as recorded by Plato, and secondly, from the libidinal upwelling of contemporary pro-Eros, pro-self-esteem, pro-risk-taking philosophies, from Nietzsche to Crowley to Nassim Taleb to the self-esteem movement to feel the fear and do it anyway to extreme sports. A kind of contemporary return to the phenomenology of vitalism and to the need for heroism and integrity and dignity and glory, of the validation and valorization of the urge to accomplish and display and get turned on and be daring and make a difference. That whole Edmund Hillary thing about climbing Mount Everest because it's there. So there's obviously a lot of there's an erotic masculinist slant to this topic, at least the way it's traditionally discussed, and I want to honor that as important, but also I want to point out right away there's no end of female Thumos, or indeed of subtler Thumos in general, that's often been unappreciated and isn't always as declaratively obvious as the cruder masculine versions. So the reason I mentioned the classical and contemporary discourse roots around Thumos is because that helps us orient to a more specific topic of conversation. Last week, I was at a monastery discussing Thumos with John Vervaeke on porch, and he takes it to be the social rather than biological emotions. And that's, to me, a plausible reading of Plato, but it doesn't necessarily point us toward what Peter Limberg is asking us about when he wants to clarify the fuck it emotion. There's a specific tone and cluster of affects that are both social and biological, and both mortidinal and libidinal, and which are different from the normal range of affects that prompt conventional behavior. So my basic argument is we can understand Thumos as one of two psychosocial biological trends relative to adaptively negotiating between order and chaos, or homeostasis and reorganization. If you're standing on a cliff, you might feel some anxiety and a desire, a basic animal organismic desire to move back, to get towards solid ground, to preserve the current organization of your unit. On the other hand, you might also feel a strange attraction that whispers you forward to the edge, a bravery or a foolishness or a risk addiction that promises either an upgrade to a more defined heroic self, or a radical reorganization accomplished by your plummeting to the earth below. So the basic image is presented to our mind and to our reasoning is that of two trends within natural drives. One which activates agency through desire to renormalize our patterning, and one which activates energy through desire to migrate us toward the limits of self-organization, to the threshold of personal and social equilibrium, where we dare the possibility of positive or negative repatterning. So that's my hypothesis. It could become a hypothesis with a little work. And maybe I'll give one more provocative illustration of what I'm talking about, which is, if you're a masochist, then you would need the intensity of pain and humiliation associated with sexuality to regulate your normal behavior. It would be your fetish that allows you to function normally the rest of the time. But if you're not a masochist and you're attracted to this and you think, hey, maybe I'll check out whether or not those intensities will distress me or disturb me or please me or make me into something else, but maybe I should give it a try, then that's the Thumos. It's looking toward the reorganizational intensity rather than looking toward the organizational intensity. And you can probably see that a world characterized by some pattern of the affordances that are analogous to developmental stages would involve a situation in which beings would have to be able to both consolidate their behavioral equilibrium and be able to dare the reorganizational intensity and unpredictable complexity associated with edge conditions, which would provide them with the confusing, destabilizing material necessary for a subsequent deeper form of self-organization. So we have an instinct for stabilizing and reproducing resources. We even have a competition for those things, but we also have a competitive instinct to risk ourselves by drawing closer to reorganizational edges that might end up as breakdown or breakthrough. So let's start, like everybody does, with Socrates, the wily old civic contemplator and public iconoclast and intersubjectivity guru who haunted ancient Athens. In the Republic, Socrates shows up using complementary analogies to illustrate and refine his instinct for justice. And it's justice in what we might call a pre-Christian or non-sentimental form. He's not talking about justice as the description of a system in which all outstanding grievances and hypocrisy and inequalities have been resolved. He's talking about justice as a condition of robust strength and health for a city-state or an individual. We should be careful, I think, with this, though, because there are some interesting ideas where Socrates is taken to be critiquing the possibility of utopia. I want to put that aside for the moment, and I want to just talk about him as describing the way certain different kinds of systems within a state or within a person can reach a more productive balance. And when he discusses that, he breaks it into three. He talks about three different subjective subsystems or souls within the human being. And this is where Thumos enters into most historical philosophical conversation. And it's interesting because there isn't a simple one-to-one correspondence with other triune models, right? When we talk about the desire and the thumos and the mind or reason that Socrates is mentioning, it's not quite the same as heart, mind, body. It's not quite the same as reptile, mammal, and neocortex. If there was an easy translation, I think it would already be subsumed into some of these more contemporary models. But this particular trinity of subjective capacities has a unique layout. So we've got the reason or the intellect, we've got the animal appetites, and we have this odd third factor that Socrates called by the old Greek word thumos, sometimes translated as spirit, but not in the sense of a supernatural spirit, more in the sense of a spirited horse. this concept, this notion of the spirited, of like the rearing stallion, as opposed to the horse that's involved in herd behavior or fleeing or eating or mating, is one that's demonstrating that it has some additional range of possibly unstable, possibly crazy, but certainly glorious and sublime capacities for engagement. I think that's what we're pointing to with the notion of the spirited horse as a translation. So I don't mind that one. I also am really fond of the old notion of the will, but I don't think that's a great translation of thumos, because there's many different ways in which we might affirm or agree or be willing, or to say I will or I can. And only a few of those for me would be characterized by the particular flavor that I'm trying to ascribe to thumos, a quality I might call self-relating bravado, closer possibly to moxie than it is to will or intention in some of the classical discussions of those words. There's an attempting and affirming, but specifically as it seems to apply to risky proposals in which the possibility of both glory and self-destruction are wholly or partially in play. You know, you could say, I will go and make myself a sandwich. That invokes the will, but it's not very thematic. Thumos seems to appear when what I will to do is to climb a mountain or stand against an army or streak through town or test a new discovery on myself or stand against an oppressor, something like that. So this is the area, the specific subset of willing that's related toward this broaching or fluctuating toward a certain limit condition, right? We might call it the fuck it threshold, where we put aside a whole set of normal concerns that keep us connected to our homeostatic equilibrium and give ourselves permission to behaviorally engage in something that might transform or destroy us. So homeostatic self-regulation is necessary for beings, but it's not sufficient for beings. And the reason is because the niches to which we're adapted are always themselves at risk and undergoing transformation. So you need to be able, as an organism at any stage of developmental complexity, to be able to have a robustness, have an anti-fragility, have the ability to deal with unexpected forms of predation, right? You might be perfectly well adapted to your city state, but then what do you do if an invading army suddenly surprises you? What do you do if you eat the wrong thing and you go into a crazed, altered state of consciousness? What do you do if the basic ecological conditions in which you've adapted begin to become unstable? So there is this necessary back and forth oppositional processing, I think, in all organisms, not just human organisms, to sustain our ability to thrive, both by having a set of affects that prompt us to secure our patterns and having a set of affects that prompt us to dare the edges of our patterning, because we absolutely need those under various conditions. I would connect a little bit, as I did in that white paper, to what Brett Weinstein called the explorer mode, which is built into the genetic evolutionary dynamics and might predispose organisms toward finding additional useful resources. But that discovery is obviously not assured in advance, right? If you're going to go to a place where you know there's a certain resource that you can consume and use for the reproduction of yourself and your culture, it requires a certain valence. But if you're going to go into territories where there might be, but may not necessarily be resources, where you might starve, or you might discover the bonanza, then you need a drive whose affective valence will be characterized by a willingness to encounter those possibilities. So for me, I'm just saying all this because I think it's important to consider thumos not just as a socially constructed set of emotions, but actually as something biologically important to organisms in general, which would then take a specific form in human societies. We would add sociability, high neural capacity, conceptuality to this, and we would have various different options about how well our society can A, provoke and cultivate and nurture this drive, but also B, steer this drive in a way that's going to serve our social needs. There are a lot of forms of thumos that might be extremely counterproductive. We can see the bravery of the terrorist right? We can see the boundary violation of the vandal. We see a lot of ways that would be socially destructive, but which might meet the thumotic drive of the individual social human organism. So one of the jobs of society is to harness that in ways that are productive. When we think of someone think of a woman who's decided she's going to take the risk of pregnancy, especially in a primitive society where that brings along with it a high possibility of death, and certainly a possibility of a radical transformation of how you organize your life. Or someone who's decided they're going to search for glory for themselves by taking a stand against an opposing army. These are forms of broaching radical transformation in far from equilibrium conditions that may be of use to the society, as opposed to being a crazed mass murderer or something like that, right? That person might also be serving a thumotic drive, but certainly not in a way that's good for everyone else. So the social field has to do these two things. They have to be able to constrain and steer the thumotic drive toward functions that are more eusocial or pro-social, but at the same time, they have to make sure that they are cultivating this drive. So the other kind of risk, apart from socially destructive thumos, is a society in which there isn't really any thumos at all, where people are basically bound into homeostatic self-regulation drives that start to look solipsistic, narcissistic, passive, and they lose the general capacity to manifest the full human condition, to challenge forth institutions, to be more humanly rich, and to be able to face unstable conditions. And this is one of the reasons I think why we're returning to some of these drives, not just because our current psychological and neurophysiological science lets us know that a huge number of energies that we used to put off limits are actually essential for our health, but also because looking at the social and technological environment we face, there are a huge number of instabilities coming down the pipeline. We have to be the kinds of creatures who manifest bravery, courage, integrity, adaptability, anti-fragility, things like that, things which are cultivated through thumotic experimentation and not necessarily cultivated through regular, stable organization of ourselves in a predictable niche. I feel like I could keep ranting about this for a while, but maybe we could just go into dialogue.
Yeah, I got a lot of questions and kind of shares. If anyone else has any, just feel free to put something in the chat. Colin, you can ask your question, Layman. I really like what you just shared. So yeah, I feel called to share that this practice I'm working on, sort of like an embodied nomenclature, where I not only like theoretically carve out and delineate the contours of a word or a concept, and also the dividing lines between other words and concepts. But also while doing that, having that kind of like an embodied somatic mapping to the experience. And I think why I was drawn to Thumos, because there's a certain experience, an embodied experience, that other words just didn't like do justice to. It just didn't feel like it mapped well. And then there's just strange, like kind of word Thumos mapped quite well to that fuck it quality. And how you described in the white paper, there's like this revving up, like which I really love that revving up quality. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit on that, not just the theoretical contours, but what's happening in the body and perhaps how you experience it.
Yeah, I think there's a possibility of an overdrive state, right? I talked about rev. I mean, you can drive appropriately at the speed limit. You can also accelerate and decelerate appropriately, but there's also times when you want to just rev the engine, and it's relational to whatever is the normal equilibrium status. But if you want to overdrive the unit, if you want to really take that car cruising and see what it can do, then that's a possibility, and it's a possibility that serves our biological inheritance and draws on the basic thermodynamic structures of the world. But there's another part to your question. I think there's a unique set of things that people are returning to. Right? I think Eros and risk and anti-fragility and Thumos are sort of all in a class together, but it has a unique flavor of its own. I think we have to tease this flavor apart from other things in that category. and that there may have been a tendency in terms of philosophical discourse historically to treat Thumos as a very dubious quality, or otherwise just to sort of lump it in with the will, or to make it subservient to various conventional motivations like bravery. Or, I mean, bravery is great, but it's not a great translation because it inherently places Thumos in that social context, and it takes away the responsibility, the vigilance for trying to capture Thumos and put it in a socially useful context. Right? There's some studies now on rethinking what testosterone does. Huberman's all over this. Right? We used to think testosterone would just massively increase a mating impulse or a physical dominance impulse in males. But what we're seeing now is testosterone will increase the automatic movement of any individual toward what they have internalized as a high status mode worth competing for. Right. So if you're in a situation where you assume physical dominance is high status, then testosterone will make you do more of that more quickly. But if you're in a situation where you assume stillness and silence and wisdom or artistic production is high status, then you will do more of that more quickly with elevated levels of testosterone. So there's I think, an importance to distinguish between the social forms of Thumos and the basic biological drive of Thumos, because that puts us back in a situation where we have to do something socially to embrace that drive and get on top of it and use it for something that's constructive.
And Fukuyama in the history, he had at least two types of Thumos, megalothymia and isothymia, like one recognizing itself as what you're referring to, one recognizing it's superior to others, and one sort of merely as equal. And the transhumanists, they some of them at least want to like cultivate, engender a society, create a society of hyperthymic individuals, so that people like 24/7 Thumos or something. And Seneca talks about euthymia. So I'm curious if there's different types of like a taxonomy that could be formed for different types of relationship, how someone can hold Thumos.
I'm sure you could probably work something out with a thumotic set point for individuals that would be different. I think Fukuyama's distinction is engaging, but a little bit problematic, right? And he admits at the end of that book, the end of History and the Last Man, that he's not quite sure what to do about the megalocychia hyperthymotic individuals. And he's thinking of them in a generally negative sense. He's thinking of like Alexander the Great or that kind of person who might be a real problem. But I think there's a way of adjusting those balances in a more non-dual sense, right? So rather than being a basic dichotomy, there's some other kind of integrative take on it. And I would say you could argue that hyperthymotic civilization is a different version of isothymotic civilization, right? There's a situation in which we can say we're all the same. And there's another situation in which we can say the thing we have in common is that we're all the most awesome person here. Right. So I think there's a need to encourage people to explore that range of sensations and the modalities of behavior that accompany that, because they lead us down idiosyncratic personal pathways. And if we're more open to that collectively, then it's more likely that those pathways will be healthy for the individuals, healthy for the relationships they're in, and healthy for the society at large. What we want to do is keep those relationships from being simple master-slave dominance, competitive winner relationships. There's a place for some of that, but we've got to really look beyond that to the full richness of what Thumos can present. To me, it's because I'm so steeped in Nietzsche, I think about it as similar to the will to power, in the sense of, yes, a person who socially takes over in a simplistic way has a certain amount of power. But when you read through Nietzsche, you get a sense of who he's talking about. When he's talking about power, he's talking about sages, poets, philosophers. This is who he means, the people who are having the experience of the power. So we need to be, that's an example of a opening to a very wide context of increasingly subtle and increasingly intense versions of Thumos. We don't want to be doing the duck version of Thumos or the gorilla version of Thumos. And as we move to higher sets of values and new worldviews, more richness of complexity and new human challenges, we want to have forms of Thumos that are appropriate to that niche and appropriate to the kinds of social environments and relationships we're trying to build, right? There's a possibility you can have a really intense, really enriching relationship with someone else who you think is awesome and who makes you feel more awesome and they think you're awesome. That's a little bit different than I always need you to acknowledge me as the superior being. That kind of relationship is very low grade Thumos, and it almost speaks to an absence of Thumos, right? One of the things you see in some ape populations is the so-called beta is the one that makes a big display of strength, while the alpha is often much quieter. So there's a sense there in which the person who's desperate to let you know that they have superior worth is actually a person who's got a lot of anxiety about whether they have any superior worth. And they probably haven't engaged in a lot of personal practices whereby they took a risk to pursue something that personally made them feel amazing and awesome and triumphant and uniquely creative according to their own value standards.
One understanding of Thumos I heard is that it's something that calls you to be seen. It's like one of the prerequisites there. Your Thumos puts you in a situation where you're seen by someone else, so your virtue is seen. I'm curious how that lands for you.
Take it in two different ways. The first is, and I think this was in the notes too, what I would call micro Thumos. There's a lot of very small motions, right? And just as anybody who's gone through shadow work or presencing or trying to have deeper dialogue with someone or just trying to be an honest person in a relationship, there's all these little moments of potential contraction and personal risk and worry that you won't be validated. And right, there's all these little hurdles, and you have to say to yourself, you know what? I'm actually worth it. I'm worth taking this risk. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe they're going to hate me if I show up more, if I say more of my truth, but I'm willing to take that risk the little deorganization or the little reorganization that's possible, right? So there's a million little thumotic opportunities in terms of showing up with each other. But also, I want to say that Thumos can't be exclusively viewed through that lens because it's not just an interpersonal phenomenon. It has a strong interpersonal dimension, but a lot of the great Thumos we've seen historically was things that happened to individuals privately, right? That they pushed their meditation to the next level, or they fought that bear in the woods that time, or they built that weird shrine that no one else even knows is out there. Right? And these are intensely thumotic things that aren't about presencing yourself socially for others. So I think you could argue that it is about showing up in certain ways, but we just need to be careful and not think that showing up is just getting acknowledgement from the other citizens all the time.
For some reason, I have a sense you have a weird shrine or two in your backyard, Layman.
Shrines.
I got 2 more questions, and we'll take in some Q&A. Put quite any questions in the chat if you have any. So I popped this quote in the chat. I think it's misattributed to a few people, but I'll read it. The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting by fools. And criticism of perhaps a criticism of places that are highly intellectual is that there's a certain softness there and a lack of Thumos. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that and how to cultivate a community, kind of like a scene, if you will, that has the best of both worlds.
I think a lot of that comes down to taking simple emotional and physical risks. I think people who are more daring in their relationships emotionally, and I think people who are more willing to undergo physical rigors and to take on physical challenges, they show up as a community of scholars very differently than a community shows up of thinkers who are not engaged in any of those activities. I also think we could redesign our systems around a principle like Taleb's notion of skin in the game. where you're at stake in the pronouncements you make. And so that you're, even though we don't want you to be destroyed by taking a risk or doing an experiment, we do want you to feel like what you say matters, that you're not merely rehearsing the history of philosophy or carefully trying to arrange your status position within an institution, or that you're not sort of carefully clinging to the branch of the established discourse. We want you to take a risk, and we want you to stand by that risk so that we can then assess it. And you should feel a little bit stung. So you could set up situations of discourse. It doesn't immediately occur to me how you would do this. I have more clear ideas about how you do it politically, say. But you should be able to set up situations in which people are able to feel strong positive or strong negative feedback from taking the risk of articulating their ideas. And then you end up with a very different community of intellectual discourse.
Cool. And so my last question, who do you think, like, examples, whether it's from like politicians, celebrities, people that embody Thumos? That could be good or bad. And one that's often attributed was Trump. Trump has a lot of Thumos, but probably would be pattern matched in the megalothymia category.
Yeah, Trump's an interesting character. In the white paper, I talk a little bit about how you relate Thumos to particular centers and organs. I used to make a joke before he ran for president that Trump was just a solar plexus on legs. None of his other chakras were functioning, but the solar plexus was like overamping all the time. And if you watch him as the host of Celebrity Apprentice, you see him as the guide, guardian, and evaluator of a lot of other people whose speciality is they are famous self-branding agents within our social field. But I think it's easy to go down the wrong pathway when you just think of it as enthusiastic self-promotion and braggadocio and things like that. When I think of Thumos, I think of a character like Martin Luther King. I think of characters like some of the great sages. I think of Gurdjieff, or even some of the weird 20th century tantric patriarchs who have some shadow side. I think of Trungpa and Adi Da and Rajneesh as characters who took a very defiant stand, who promoted themselves as functional transcendental characters, but in a way that was really unique, really strange. I think of some of the great writers and poets, people of whom we might say they have a lot of voice. I think William Burroughs had a lot of Thumos. I think Hunter S. Thompson had a lot of Thumos. I think most of the great artists have to, because there's no need for them to do what they're doing. If you've ever been around some of Rodin's sculptures, they're just so massive and ponderous, and your feeling is, what the fuck was this guy doing? And yet he put the time in to do this weird thing that maybe nobody would like, and maybe it would destroy him, right? That is incredible. And it's something that it turns out we all benefit from. So for me, a lot of those unique, idiosyncratic, high-powered spiritual, philosophical, and artistic and political characters fall into that category. I look to them personally more so than I would look to the warrior class, but I think the ethics of the warrior class need to inform all the other classes to some extent.
And do you do that because you aspire to that archetype more so than the warrior class?
Yes. I mean, so for me, the kind of person I want to be has to, for me, be the best kind of person. And there's another interesting aspect there when I say the best, which is we have a certain, perhaps culturally acquired discomfort with superlatives. There are traditions that are much better. If you listen to a really good Islamic prayer, and they're, oh God, the most high and the most glorious and the most merciful, right? There's this use of peak qualifiers, which I think Thumos gives us access to in a certain way. That you want to be the best, or you feel you are the best, or maybe you feel everyone's the best, or this idea I came up with, which is so crazy, I can't resist it. It might be the most amazing thing ever. and I'm willing to take the risk for that. So I think one of the, if we were going to create a class of sub-skills that made us more capable of being thematic, one of those sub-skills would be more facility with superlative modes of description and affect and relating to things.
Cool, cool. So I'll refrain from asking what's your take on the Thumos levels for each member of the liminal web. We'll save that for the after party. We all know Jabravegi's at the top, so we could. So yeah, we got some great questions. Kevin, I'm going to take you in.
Hey, Layman. I'm wondering if you think can be such a thing as collective Thumos versus like what you've said so far. It sounds like it's more oriented around a specific individual. For example, Peter Thiel loves complaining that in 1969 we put on a man on the moon, but then 3 weeks later Woodstock happened and then hippies took over. But to me, it seems like those are both two different collective, like thematic movements. One was like, Apollo 11, very Apollonian, like literally putting a man on the moon. The other was more of like had a Dionysian characteristic of like artists, pushing the limits of art and whatnot. I'm wondering like what you think about collective Thumos and what kind of current possibility you see for like thematic movements and the nature of the collective versus individual nature of these kind of thematic movements.
I don't think there's any reason why distributed interpersonal intelligence couldn't exhibit more Thumos than some other distributed collective intelligence. I think that's an area definitely worth studying, but also, those kind of entities are things we know very little about at the moment. There's the risk possibility, right? You might have a country, and maybe we could name Russia, maybe we could name the United States sometimes, that believes their ancient exceptionalism is somehow a justification for poor and reactive actions. But we can also see that sometimes creates an atmosphere in which the people in those nations come together to do amazing things. And I think you're correct to point to, the moon landings and Woodstock as being somehow on the same page, right? There are these periods of time when it seems easier for the ethos, for the scene, to create a lot of crazy attempts, some of which in hindsight turn out to have been great, and they can be all across the landscape. Just like we have to be careful not to think of Thumos as a specially male phenomenon as opposed to female, we have to make sure we don't think of it as Peter Thiel might, as a special conservative phenomenon as opposed to a liberal phenomenon. All of the forms and moods of activity should have their own appropriate destructive and or generative forms of Thumos. Right? And some of them are unseen. Some of them are crazy. I mean, sometimes when you think about what is a transgender person doing, that's really crazy. I'm going to fucking stand against everybody else. I'm going to restructure my body, right? There's lots of failure modes for that. There's lots of wrong reasons to maybe get involved in that. A lot of weird social hysteria around that. But at the level of an individual taking that kind of risk, almost the opposite of the people who just love the moon landing, but still really putting themselves at that thematic edge.
Any follow-up question, Kevin, or share?
Not really. No, great response. Thank you.
All right. Mary Andrea, you had a question about Eros and Thumos.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to hear you speak to the Eros-Thumos relationship, whatever.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a slippery one because they're very similar in some ways. And so trying to tease them apart becomes tricky. Thumos involves some kind of arousal, some kind of activation, some kind of feeling of being turned on, probably in multiple different systems or centers of the being. So it's likely that we would characterize it as some form of an erotic drive. But also you could say that there is, if we make theros the opposite of thanatos, if we're thinking of libido and mortido in that kind of Bard and Soderquist fashion, if you're familiar with that, then it's also risking its own destruction. It's not just generative. It's not just Eros in the sense of, I want to bring forth the new leading edge phenomenon. It's also thanatos in the sense of, maybe this is going to wipe me out completely. I'm going into a potential disorganizational situation of intensity. But I would say that likely people who can feel erotic, or let's just say stimulating flows through their organs and their neurophysiology in that Wilhelm Reich kind of sense, those people are probably more likely to experience and integrate thumos than people who can't feel those flows of stimulation. And then we can look at relationships, right? That any particular sexual relationship, we're taking Eros in terms of the human sexual domain, might be characterized by more or less thumos, right? You might find that some people have a kind of a neutral or a functionalistic or a reproductive orientation, and other people want their sexual life to really make them feel like they're a god or a goddess engaged in some special activity that's overloading all normal experience. So I think we can see that some Eros comes with thumotic forms, but not all Eros. But the engagement of thumos must draw on some energies of Eros in order to manifest itself. So that sounded confusing when I said it. Okay.
All right. Holly, you had a question to share.
Yeah, so I'm curious about your perspective on thumos and slowing down. In that a lot of times I notice in the work that I do that some of the biggest fears and risks are in actually slowing down and kind of doing like what Zach's saying, the bearing the unbearable image. And so that intrapsychic work and how thumos relates to slowing down, collapse, and facing one's inner demons.
Yeah, that's a great question. It reminds me of the Woodstock and moon landing question, right? We have to understand thumos very broadly and understand that it can apply to all kinds of domains. And those can be geographic domains, social domains, philosophical domains. It can also be tempos. Because a lot of what we resist and would need to take a risk to face is something that shows up when we slow down. Sometimes we use speed to be cowards. Right? And also there's whole terrains that are only available when we're more cautious at the thresholds of things. We encounter additional richness of information, and that information is exciting to us if we're in explorer mode. We're like, I want to be able to colonize all of the things at all of these subtle thresholds, and I won't be able to do that if I miss them. So in a way, it's the same as an explorer charting his path out into the jungle. You say, the jungle I'm interested in is what's all this stuff in between us? What's all this stuff that shows up when you slow down? What's all this stuff at the edges of things that I have to be more present and more careful in order to find? But it's still saying, I'm the kind of person who deserves to find that out, and I'm going to take the risk to find that out. And I kind of don't care what happens to me because I really need to know, and I'm going to show up for that.
Any follow-up share, Holly?
No, but thank you so much. I mean, the word colonize sort of popped out at me, and I need to sort of metabolize that.
Sure.
Christy, did you have a question? Are you still here? Okay, maybe not. Jessica, you had a question.
Yes, thank you so much. And my question follows up a little bit on what Holly was saying. It's about, Viktor Frankl saying that there's a space between stimulus and response, and in that space is our ability to choose, and that's where our freedom and power comes from. And I'm wondering about whether thumos emerges in that space. So we're not running our own patterns. Like each space between stimulus and response could be considered a liminal space. And then if I can slow down enough to perceive a choice and move in the direction of the right choice, what it feels like to me is then, if I'm meeting the moment, that there's something comes, the power and energy comes in that moment to fund that. And so that's what I think thumos might be, but I just wondered what you thought of that. And but I can also spend that energy on something else that isn't meeting the right thing, and then it feels like it kind of falls away or goes in. And so anyway, that's my question. What do you think of that?
the way I would connect those is in terms of the extended conversation Socrates is having, right? He's trying to say we're going to bring in reason, right, and philosophical reason, not just rational left brain obsession. And we're going to use reason to try to balance between these two different horses, the horse of the desires that lead us toward homeostatic self-regulation and the desires that lead us toward taking those extra risks and challenges. And in any moment, it might be appropriate to do one or the other. And you don't have any freedom to go in one of those directions unless you're aware of that in-between space, right? You might be automatically drawn to a thumotic engagement. I just see somebody uselessly rush out onto the battlefield and get incinerated. And it would have been nice if they had a moment's choice to consider that maybe they want to keep their life and their family and their world going more sensibly. On the other hand, we might need to break out of our conventional patterns, and we don't have that choice unless we see that there's some space between the trend that moves to the edge of our self-regulation and the trend that conserves our self-regulation. And I think that the ability to show up rightly and to meet the moment, it does put us between dichotomies almost all the time. I think it is an inherently liminal phenomenon. I don't think every one of those liminal phenomenon is in the thumos to appetite relationship, but I think that's certainly one example of how the general pattern operates.
Thanks, Jessica. Robert, the man who probably started Thumos Awareness Week by asking me the question, Peter, what's Thumos? You had a question for Layman.
I love it. Yeah, this birthed so much goodness for sure. And so, yeah, I was wondering, like, I think of Achilles, and he kind of takes time off to be with Patroclus, and they're listening to music and eating food. And then Odysseus comes in and pulls him back into action. So how do we kind of not let Thumos destroy us? Because we don't want to just be on all the time or channel it into communication and just be like logically arguing. And then especially like if you have friends or people that you care about that are just kind of sulking like Achilles, like how do you delicately induce them back into their glorious fullness so that the war can be fought, or the gods can play out, so to speak?
Well, part of that is just basic human relating. You got to meet them where they are. You got to let somebody go through their cycle to get themselves back on track. But I think two of the things that I might have touched on that are pertinent to this are one, understanding and be able to share and have as presupposed background the notion that there are different degrees of intensity and subtlety in Thumos. So you might be able to say to a person who otherwise is very thumotic that the way they're showing up right now is not a very good way to do that same thing, that it's actually below their own standards of value. And if they can experience and stay in between their behavior and their value, then they might be able to, if they can live out that contradiction, I think they'll come back online into a more aligned position more quickly. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to mention to someone a little bit earlier, being able to show up for our discomfort, being able to show up for our remorse, being able to dare the contradiction between our values and behavior is a way often of getting ourselves back on a thumotic track. But also it takes some thumos already to go, hey, I'm more awesome than the version of myself that wants to hide away from the contradictions in my behavior. I'm going to show up for that. And if it turns out that I'm sulking or failing or being the depressive jerk version of myself, then I'm willing to take the risk. And I hope my friends are going to help me take the risk of seeing that that's the case and that that's below me, because actually I'm so thumotically amazing that this is below me. So I think that's a part of it. And another part of it is to understand this richness in the range of affects and qualities that can be part of Thumos, because there are so many different really worthy qualities of being that sometimes if a person gets disgruntled or reactive or contracted from one area of life, what they need is to be able to find inspiration and superlative qualities in some other aspect of being, right? You could be a warrior all week, and maybe it's going to destroy you if you don't also go to the park and go, you know, I saw a blue jay, I saw an oak tree. It was magnificent. It was beyond ordinary evaluation. It was something that called me back to having a surplus relationship to myself and the world. So I think having a more flexible sense of all the different ways we can find thumos makes it more likely for people to be able to find their way back, because they have more tributaries back to the river.
Any follow-up question?
Yeah, I guess just how do you sustain that? Like you mentioned MLK earlier, and he had Thumos for like years, and it never really went way off. I mean, he was definitely not a perfect person, but it like taking cold showers and you get all pumped up and you go, or you stop sulking for a day, like that's kind of neat. But then like if you want to really accomplish something kind of unique, or even live, like I love that you said ordinarily, like just being impressed by the vitality of life all around you, like how does one maintain that hum, I guess, if you have any thoughts on practices or things like that?
Well, a lot of the basic health practices are like this, right? If you're not regularly in some kind of relationship that challenges you, if you're not regularly doing physical exercise where you have to push past your tendency to be in the normal, slightly degenerative loop of your behaviors and activities, then you're going to have a more difficult time. If you're not using your sense of, let's say, exalted self-worth to help regulate your diet, then you're probably going to eat things that you don't really think make you into the best version of yourself. So there's Thumos supportive activities, just as basic life and relationship practices, and those are essential. There's also the possibility of being more contemplative about it. And sometimes that looks like just becoming more able to spend a longer period of time in the feeling of the magnificence of things. And other times, very traditionally, it's been to associate that with some special state of being or act of service to a power that exceeds the powers of the world, right? The great Christian mystics and Christian warriors have exemplified some of this, but of course you find it in all the traditions of trying to be contemplatively, affectively, emotionally, and then posturally also in sustained communion with that quality of the thing whose value overrides all the other values, the most tremendous, the all-accomplishing, the superlative, sublime thing, and to experience your desire to be thumotic as part of your service to the principle of Thumos that pervades the universe. I think that can really help people to have both a broader sense of what it is, so they collapse less quickly and less frequently, but also there's a real chemical process in trying to be able to sustain that state. There's a very classic thing from positive psychology and Buddhist psychology. You can get better at your positive feelings. We might class Thumos as one of those positive feelings. If you can find it, locate it, hold it, imagine it back into being, feel it in your body, intensify it with self-suggestion, or just generally stay with it as an act of feeling attention for a longer period of time, then that builds into a skill whereby you can find it again more quickly, that it's more robust against the circumstances of your life.
All right, thanks, Robert. I think that's it for the, oh yeah, Fred, you had a share or a question.
I was thinking about, well, first, Layman, you were able to unpack Thumos and different aspects of it, and then we just started to get into the relationship between Thumos, say, and reason. I was thinking of he must not be named the former president of the U.S., and he was like all thumos and no reason. His drives were just disconnected from anything around reason. It was always pleasing the crowd and being outrageous. So, what have you discovered about the relationship of thumos to, well, in the Platonic, Socratic metaphor, the reason and the appetites, or however else you'd like to frame it? What's a healthy relationship of thumos to the other centers?
Yeah, the first thing is that reason has to be present, and it has to be aware that there isn't just one set of drives pulling in one direction. The classic image of the charioteer and the chariot and these two horses. You want to yoke them. You want them to be as coordinated as possible. And the minimum thing that requires is to know about both of them and not to just be constantly automatically responding to your impulses. You're not in a position to be the implementer of reason unless you're aware that there are these contrasting forces that need to be recognized, known, inspected in their interactions, and ultimately balanced. Right? And when we talk about reason as opposed to just rationalizing, we sort of invoke this classical philosophical notion of reason as being the faculty that leads us toward wisdom, which is often represented by the scales. And I think two of our internal systems are the appetites and the thumos. What we're trying to do essentially as a reasoning being is recognize them, know about them, weigh them out appropriately, and weigh them relative to contexts and circumstances. That's the minimum we would expect. You might also say that reason, in that philosophical sense, depends upon living a life of practice, a life of intentionality, when you're able to think of something and implement it in opposition sometimes to your appetites and in opposition sometimes to your thematic drives. So the more that reason, let's say, arms itself or avails itself of the capacity to be an intentional agent in the world, to do things on purpose, to learn things on purpose, then it gains the capacity to regulate these two phenomena and balance them out, just as it gains a capacity to regulate and balance out many other internal subsystems. Because the problem, the deficient form of reason relative to appetite and thumos would be a form that sort of knew they were both there, but wasn't capable of getting those two horses to coordinate. And that coordination requires some force. Like you can imagine two animals pulling in two different directions. You want to get them to work together, you're going to have to exert, in a sense. It's not enough just to know about them. You must know about them, but then it becomes something about developing a certain kind of strength of reason that can be imposed. And I say imposed, but it's as much learning a language as it is applying a force. But you've got to be able to strongly, intentionally engage these phenomena from the point of view of reason, which means reason has to feel strong, has to be capable of adjudicating and modulating the activity of these systems. And that requires a classical life of practice in some form.
Is there any follow-ups here, Fred? Cool. So yeah, that brings us to the top of the hour, and awesome session. Good start to Thumos Awareness Week. Perhaps as a close, I'm going to take and Layman at the end for any parting thoughts. But if anyone has a practice that they use, because we're talking about practice here at the Stoa. Layman just came back from a retreat on wisdom and ecology of practices. So anyone has any practices they would recommend that would engender Thumos, perhaps that could be used in a wise way, put it in the chat. We'll pop in Steve Beatty's newly designed Thumos breath that you can watch on I think it's a combination of thymus thumping that people do, and then just Wim Hof breath work. So you can try that out. And yeah, Layman, any go-to practice you have, and any parting thoughts, words that you'd like to leave with us today?
First of all, sign up for the Parallax Non-Duality course. One of the things in terms of breath that I really enjoy is a kind of spontaneous pranayama, which is whenever I suddenly take in a little more air, for any reason, I try to go with that. And I like to hold it and feel the sensations of the excitement that the oxygen brings in the body, expanding, and cooperate posturally with that. And I think the reason I like doing that is because the decontraction of the physiology is an important part of accessing Thumos, right? To be uncontracted, to be expanded, not to get stuck in expansion, but just to be able to teach ourselves physically and emotionally that we are capable of a fully open posture, that I can open my eyes and open my mouth and expand my rib cage, expand my hips, and open myself out to the full limit of what I'm capable of feeling. I think that's a really powerful thumotic practice, right? To go right all the way to your own edge, to be completely uncontracted in your own experience of yourself.
Yeah, that's a good one. And the one that you mentioned earlier, like working out, that's definitely for me. Just if I can get in a workout where I sweat, and then just at like one moment where I feel like I put myself at my edge a little bit. It doesn't have to be the whole exercise, just like one moment. It feels like it engenders Thumos throughout the day.
And there's I say this as a an inveterate Gurdjieffian. When I do my physical workouts in the morning, and I also recommend the Wim Hof breathing is great, the cold showers are great, but when I do a physical workout, I'm also trying to make a mental and emotional effort at the same time, right? And that makes it even more difficult. Say like let's say you're, I talked to Daniel about this earlier. Let's say you're planking, right? And you're also going to count by threes, and you're also going to try to hold gratitude. Then it's not enough. You have to keep going. No, fuck that. I set a task. I'm pushing through. I've got this thing. I have an internal and emotional and physical thing I'm trying to do. So my opportunity to push past my own limit on purpose and say, no, I'm going to do it this way, is magnified because I'm doing it in multiple systems simultaneously. And often you walk away from that practice going, I must be some kind of god, or whatever result you expect Thumos to have.
Gratitude planks. It's going to be a new addition to the Wisdom Gym. And I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Layman, thank you so much for kickstarting Thumos Awareness Week and everything you do. That was a great session today. And we have 3 other sessions this week. Next one is tomorrow. The Politics of Thumos, Spirited Motivation of the Human Soul with Josh Wilborn tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. So you can check that out at thestoa.ca. So that being said.
Fantastic. I mean, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Peter. And thanks to Robert for kind of setting this stuff in motion. And I think Thumos Awareness Week, this is a unique thing in the history of philosophical thought. There's never been any such thing as a Thumos Awareness Week. So this is tremendous. I'm glad people are digging in on this, and I'm glad you're willing to take it with these people to that edge of discovery. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks, brother. And thanks everyone for coming to the Stoa today. Hope to see you later in the week.